this computer. Yes. Okay, now,
Okay.
so yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so this is version 1 of the Codex Standoff Properties Editor, and this is a standalone JavaScript module. It doesn't have any dependency on a graph database or SQL or anything. All it does is it takes a JSON object, turns it into this editor, and then it spits out a JSON object when you want to unbind or you want to publish this. So which we can see down here. So if I click unbind, I can see my text and I can see all my annotations. And if I make some changes to this text, now I can unbind that, which effectively means to publish that. And I can even refresh the page, go back, paste it in, and there I go. So this is a standalone JavaScript editor, takes JSON, returns JSON. Now, every character here is treated by the editor as like an object in itself, a cell, like imagine a cell connected in a list. Okay. And the annotations are defined as having a starting cell and an ending cell. For a zero width annotation, essentially it's between cells. Now, as I click around here, you can see that when I click on the green line, we get a different entity appears down in this bar. So if I hover over that, I can see I've got various things I can do with this entity. For example, I can move that annotation around, for example. There we go. I can make it longer or shorter and so on. So these are some tools for managing the annotations now, and also they are resilient. So I can add text and the annotation remains intact. Now, what's interesting to me about this as well is, like you said, here we have some overlap between this section and this section, and we can see we get two annotations there. We can highlight over them. But basically what this editor does, this editor takes plain text, takes this array of annotation objects, and then depending on how the JavaScript is set up in the editor, it will determine how that is rendered on the screen. So it could be invisible information, like a page boundary or something. And we can see here there's a date annotation, which is not really, we don't have to visualize it. We could just have it invisible, or we can draw a line, whatever. Now, this is not restricted to just underlining things. We could also, for example, we could give it a centering annotation. We can make it, go to the right, let's say. So we can start to, this is pure standoff. There's no XML, there's no HTML. So there's an annotation called alignment right, and that tells the editor how to handle that block of text. Okay. Now that means we can do a whole bunch of other things. So we can do, of course, all the usual things, bold and italics and strike through and so on. We can do some things which text editors normally maybe don't do. We can play. We can put whatever we want into that. Now, when we can also add, we can put images in there. We can have annotations which appear on the side and the margins. We can put videos. And we can also do something which you normally don't see in a text editor. You can have annotations which are animated because they have JavaScript behaviors. So I can pause this and play this. I could do things like I could flip that text, make it like Da Vinci's text. I could invert it. I could make it spin around like a clock. And in the meantime, I can be typing away. And I can keep on adding annotations in there. I can check a bold annotation. I can overlap between this and that. And we can see there, we've got the clock annotation, the bold annotation. I can get rid of the clock annotation. And then you can add things like, little objects, essentially like, zero width objects, which can animate emojis, or we could have a spinning character. And we could do, just fun things that your typical rich text editor, which everyone holds up as the, what users want. The rich text editors that we have are really static and boring in comparison to what we can do when we have a different approach to markup. When we say, actually, the markup can contain its own execution. It can be aware of where it's in the document and what's going on. It can have a whole bunch of capabilities that just applying a class to something doesn't give you. So I think this is something that I discovered implementing Standoff in this editor, was that there's practically no limits. You can tinker with this and whatever you can do. I mean, I eventually within the Codex. Can you see the screen? Yep, cool. So I'm going to log in. And can you see my Codex screen here with the backdrop and everything? Okay. So I'm going to see if I can find something. This is the first iteration of the Codex OS idea. This is not the one that we're working on at the moment, but this is a different one. But we can even use SVG. So we could decide that, for example, this is an SVG rainbow underline. And basically a function is being invoked, which is redrawing this SVG rainbow whenever we change something. We can have a bunch of symbols. We can do, we'd even, let's say, look up here. So I don't know if I've got this one up. I must have taken the button off. But there's fun things we can do with SVG, which are basically allow you to do things which are impossible with CSS. We can have, for example, we could wrap that in an SVG box, and it will draw to the dimensions of that selection. And then we could have another box, which overlaps that, and that whole thing can be redrawn as you're typing or deleting, whatever, which is just not available to us with CSS. So, and I think that's something that Standoff gave me in the process of doing this editor, was a kind of a distance from having to use, think in a CSS way, or thinking about elements and blocks of text, but really thinking about when your building block is a cell, you can do a lot, and you have a lot of information about that cell. You can do a lot of things with it. And I think we could do a lot more if it was a native application, if it wasn't using HTML and JavaScript. We could take this a lot further. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to Standoff. And when this document gets saved, it's just going to output, again, Standoff JSON. And if your editor doesn't support those things, if you don't have an editor which can do rainbow underlines, then your document will still be readable. It'll still have the annotations, but you just won't see those underlines. You might see, some other representation. So I think there's real power in the Standoff way of working with Standoff at the kind of as a medium, basically.
This is awesome, man. And I believe one of the main pain points, at least for us, and I see in like in your case, you build it yourself, the whole editor, which is how boring editors are, or how hard it is to actually work with this. Like, for example, in our case, we are now using Slate.js. And Slate.js is very like document state-based, hierarchical. It's very non-opinionated. It's very flexible. You can do whatever you want. Like the most pain thing that I found is that you have to do everything if you want to do
Yeah.
like very crazy things. But it's hard to work on a setting that you have layers on top of text when you are required to have JSON structure to consume that information. And in
Yes.
our case, like it's forcing us to have this like transformation step between what the user is actually doing in the editor and how we are storing that in the backend, in the actual database and in the backend.
Yeah.
So yeah, we I don't know. I maybe I'm not smart enough to work on a rich text editor that actually does this. But I believe there's some things in Prosemira that are like pointing into that direction, but
Yes. Yes.
it still like doesn't quite fit properly. I don't know what are your like other like experiences with other text editors.
I've had on a shallow level some experience with Tiny, MPC, MCE, and with Slate, but my co-founder has had a lot more experience with CodeMirror, as in like he's written extensions to CodeMirror, and
Okay.
The next version of the Codex editor, text editor, will use CodeMirror as a foundation, and the standoff will be on top of that.
Oh, nice. So you
Yeah.
choose CodeMirror on top of Prosemira, which is,
Yes.
huh? Which I would like to
Um,
know like the decision, the like why one and not the other, because the
well, this
underlying
yeah.
information are kind of similar, right? Or is there something
I
intrinsically like foundational that both work differently?
For one way, I'm not, to be honest, an expert in those two projects. I believe Prosemira emerged as a derivative of CodeMirror. I could be wrong. Um, but I think aside from his familiarity with CodeMirror, I think the thing that attracted him to it was it has a lot of built-in support for programming language syntax highlighting. And we want the editor, although this is not really thought of as being a code editor, if you think about what you use a PKM for, you're going to be chucking in samples of JavaScript or TypeScript or Python or something. So it's nice to be able to have support for that at the level of the editor, so we don't have to build in a lot of things. And it has an extensible mechanism for that as well. But something that where standoff will be integrated with that. So you could have the syntax highlighting as a feature of CodeMirror, but then you can have the standoff properties giving you information on top of that as well. So we may not stick with that in the long run. I mean, because it's difficult to get these two things to talk to each other, especially with the broader system of what we're doing with reactivity in Codex, the new Codex. But for now, it's definitely workable, and yeah, it's a bit more scalable for bigger documents than the editor that I developed in a kind of more ad hoc way. But there are some fun things, I think, if you don't mind me showing you a couple of things here. And sometimes I go a bit fast with these things because I'm very used to the editor. But one thing I'd like to show you, so I put this document in, which is an article about two great pianists of the 19th century. And I wanted to annotate this article a bit. So one thing we can do to help us kind of see what's been annotated is we can hit this key binding, and this key binding will show me all of the entities that have been annotated. So not all of the standard properties, but all of the entity properties. And I can, for example, I can reorder that alphabetically by entity name, textual reference, let's say, or maybe this is quite useful. I can order that by the frequency of the references. So I can see that list is the most frequently referenced, then Salotti, Rubinstein. Now you'll notice that as I hover over each name, it also updates on the other side, and it's very quick as well. So it's also creating this mini map showing you where the standoff properties appear in the document. And I can click, if I click it, it will activate that, and I can see it fixes it. And I could click another one, and I can see just these two together. That this is where Rubinstein is mentioned, this is where Liszt is mentioned. And I could say, show me where Liszt and Salotti are mentioned. Now, the other thing I can do as well is, because this is all connected to the standoff properties, I could do something like, let's say I find the Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven. I've got another button here, which I call the accordion. And let's see if this works. Yeah. This takes the standoff properties and compresses.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
This is nice.
So,
yeah.
Yeah. This is the same text. Like, it's still the same thing. I can go and change it and do things to it. It's actually quite a simple process, because once I have an array of standoff properties and these standoff properties map back to the DOM, I can do things like, find every container that has got one of these matching references and use some algorithm to determine the height of this view. I can, scroll inside and out and so on.
Man, this reminds me so much Douglas Engelbart view specs. This is a view spec. Like, you are saying, I want to see all the references to this entity.
Yes.
And I don't want the clutter
Absolutely.
of scrolling everything. I just want to see them all.
But the fun thing is, I found as well, once you see this, you realize that it actually creates a new narrative. Because if I'm now reading, I'm not just jumping from reference to reference, I'm reading. Let's say I go, okay, let's read all about the Moonlight Sonata. Now I'm kind of reading an article about the Moonlight Sonata in a way. I mean, it's a bit fragmented, like it sort of jumps around, but it's taking the same long document and then giving me like this kind of, it's taking all these slices and it's putting all the slices, squishing them together to make another document in a way.
Well, you're also allowing yourself, in fact, the affordance of actually yet more view specs, because in a sense, not just what you're showing, but for instance, the sort of heat map down the side. Well, if you took that and you might want to do something, put it into a, not so much 3D, but a sort of 2.5D space. In other words, something where it's a kind of thing you just want to, you want to sort of take it as a jigsaw problem. It's right, there's an association here. I don't know quite what it is, but I've got all the pieces here, and I want to tip these pieces out onto a space, and I want to do things with them. And that's to me the lovely forms of sort of the view spec approach. The data's all there underneath, and you assemble a view for the task you need to do. Because often we get, culturally, the text plays so strongly to us that we sometimes get over anchored, and that may not be where the insight comes from all the extra that's been done. It also occurs to me a couple of things that as you explain this is that, and you're talking about the code mirror and prose mirror and things, is that I couldn't help thinking how this sort of loosely links to things like I think they've been renamed since Jupyter Notebooks. So I know that there are people doing a different thing, but not totally dissimilar in the sense of they wanted programmable text. But it's not such a big leap. So they're starting saying, I want to type some code and I want it to do something. So, and this also has a link to me to the concept of what they call it, literate programming, where you essentially say what you want to do, and the process goes away and does it for you. Because I'm not a programmer. I mean, I've been close enough to know that, despite my best efforts, I will never be one of facility. So I do scripting and stuff, but I would rather leave skilled work to skilled people. So I respect it for what it is, but I know I'm not particularly good doing that, and which keeps me grounded in the fact that for most people, a lot of this is at first sight incredibly sort of arcane and abstract, and yet what you're doing is exactly the sort of associative thing that we do in here really, really fast. So giving people the tools. So in other words, rather than printing out on a piece of paper, getting a set of colored highlighters out and thinking, oh, right, at this point, I now have lots of colored highlighting on text and I still don't have any actionable objects. Capturing it like this, I think, is remarkably rich. I mean, it's not something you're going to need to write a shopping list, but that's, you know, not everything has to be that simple. But I can think of lots of areas where this is remarkably rich and interesting. And I love the fact that, you know, in a sense that even if there are other types of media in it, that essentially the text, for want of a better term, is still there, because that's your sort of canonical object in a way. And to a certain extent, presumably, there's nothing to stop you doing similar annotation, say, of video. Because
absolutely,
frame granularity gives you a cell.
Yes. I mean, in fact, in many ways, video is even easier, because a video, typically you don't change the video. I mean, unless you're an editor and you have specialized tools.
You're right.
Yeah, actually doing this on a mutable text is a lot harder than just saying, let's record, let's make an annotation from 30 seconds to 34 seconds or something. And I mean, I can imagine one way of doing this would be simply you have like a record button and then you have a stop button, and you just say, when something's on the screen, you just hit record and you start typing in a little window, and then you could stop at any time. And that's your annotation, you know.
The interesting part is that it's the same concept. So stepping back from the mechanics of how you affect the editing, which are not trivial. Don't mean to suggest that, but the elegance to me seems to be that you have the same annotation structure, because that's where you get tractability. Because something, I mean, so whilst you might have the original text is useful, again, for something like traditional machine learning, which wants to do its probabilistic read through, but actually being able to point to it and say, well, here are all these hints that we've already built for you.
Exactly.
So you, as a very fast thinking machine, can go away and do things that we didn't spot. Because one of the challenges, I suppose a lot of the stuff I do is sort of broadly PKM early stage stuff, where actually the easy stuff is building a graph of what you know, in a way. I mean, because you know what it is. You know, the doing of it may take lots of work, but it's not hard. You know that the people are the people and they're not animals. It's looking for the dark matter. It's saying, well, why is there no path from here to there? I know they're in some way connected. So I know that the blue things are different from the green things. But you know, why is there a gap sort of here? And whether that's sort of, you know, and that might be in a space in here, it might be in a view that you created, but it's that kind of thing where our sort of thinking, I think, can contribute. Because if nothing else, we can say, look, there's a hole here that you a machine will never see.
Well, that's right.
I'm telling you, there's a hole there. So I like you to know there's a hole there, because I really want to fill that hole. I just don't know what goes in it, and maybe you might have an idea.
And this is the other thing. Like, the more we start to fill those holes in ourselves, the more the machine has to work with. That goes beyond just a generic understanding of text vectors. It goes, well, okay. For example, in this paper on Codex, which is my first paper on Codex, I started annotating it. And I've got this word text, and I realized as I was annotating this paper that I used the word text in 4 or 5 different distinct meanings. But once you start the process of annotation, you also start thinking about, so now for me, the thing about Standoff that's nice is I don't have to change my words. I can keep using the word text in this polysemic way without worrying about it. But I can also capture the specific meaning. So I can say in here, text as characters, like one letter after another, text as a database, a text node.
You're actually giving context to a particular word, which is very interesting.
And then we could even read the paper in that way, or we could highlight, you know, we could see that, you know,
And it's funny,
text isn't feeding.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned this is some like video in video, like the frame is the canonical value, but it could be more granular. It could be I can put like I can train a machine learning model to say, okay, every time like record when every time the main character appears. So we can
Right,
have an
right.
annotations that say, okay, these are the frames in which the main
Yes.
character appears.
Yeah.
And then we can create a short video about it. It's
Yeah.
amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to, and that's what I mean, machine learning in that very specific way. I mean, I've seen an amazing demonstration of this automated labeling of video in real time. You know, it's going and labeling entities, and it's like, you know, like you said, I mean, not only when does this character appear, but maybe it will actually map it out for you, you know, and then you could ask interesting questions of it, because what you're creating is a database, a semantic database, and you can ask questions of the database. You can say, show me frames in the movie where this character appears within 100 pixels of this object, you know, and that might represent a particular decision on the part of the cinematographer to associate these two things in the same frame in a certain alignment. And that's the kind of skill that is usually the province of the film critic, you know, who's got the time to look at and write something detailed. But I mean, AI could generate the raw semantic information that anyone could start asking those questions. It could be very interesting. The other thing that this is just the sort of the final thing. I don't want to take up too much time or anything, but just something that you might be interested in. Let's see if I can get this working. Okay. So because we have the text, we have the annotations, and we have the graph, I can actually generate a graph view of the entities that are annotated in this document. And I can it's also important to restrain the context, not to have too much in. So the constraint that I've put here is to only show relationships between entities which are in this document. So don't just show everything that they link to. Show, because this is what's interesting me at the moment that I'm reading the document, is the relationships between the things that I can see. So, for example, I can actually see that I can see what the central concepts are of this paper, standoff properties and text, and then I can kind of go in a bit further. I can see basically this is like a series of statements about standoff properties. I can see that standoff properties mediate a database with nodes and edges, or they record textual properties, or da-da-da. Now, the other thing you might notice as well is that we have the gray arrows and red arrows. And the red ones, these annotations, the relationships are annotated themselves, the edges. Okay, so if I click that red edge, it will take me to the text block where that relationship is annotated. And so I can go back, I can go from the text to the graph view, from the graph view back to the text view, and go in and out. So the graph can keep on adding a kind of superstructure view. But then if I want to see, well, what does he mean by, why does he say this is standoff properties, record textual properties? Where does that come about? I can see that's where the claim for that. Now, this annotation is a bit broken in this document because of experimentation, but it shows you more or less, you know, it's got the right block of text.
It's also an interesting tellback to if you were the author of the document, is
Yes.
it's in a sense, does it, well, interesting, for instance, so literally to a constructed programmatic understanding, does it say what I thought I was saying?
Yes.
Which can be remarkably useful because, of course, we always write beautiful things that are never ambiguous and say exactly what we mean. But of course, it turns out that's never quite the case.
Well, this is a core driver for me. And like one of my influences has been the literary, I'm not sure what you call him, theorist or critic, I.A. Richards from the early 20th century. And he was very interested in the meaning of meaning, or semantics. He was trying to kind of make a science of semantics. And he even developed his own markup system in pure text form to try and control meaning. He was interested in how do people indicate meaning? How do they resolve conflict between meanings? How do we tease out different meanings and things? And the central problem that he came to see, like, he kind of drifted away from literary criticism and linguistics and semantics. He drifted into almost politics. He was talking about, he thought that the problem of language and ambiguity was the central problem of the 20th century, because people are using words and making arguments where they don't, almost through no fault of their own, they don't understand what they're saying, and what they say gets misinterpreted. And what happens is that there is a lack of control in the language, where even the writer can start to lose control of what they're thinking, and the language can lead them through a kind of series of associations away from formulating a clear thought. And that's where I thought that having this graph view might be an interesting corrective to that. Like, if in the process of writing, you're seeing something which visualizes how you've used these concepts before and relationships that you've established between them, you could have that as something that kind of sits beside your text. And maybe, you know, you can compare what you're writing to something more visual. Say, is this the meaning of text that I had in mind? Is that appropriate? Maybe I need a different word, or maybe I need to explain it more, or something. I mean, this is a very clumsy way of doing that. It's not really designed properly to do that, but it's something that I would like to do, you know, is to create the tooling for that. I think that could be very interesting, for not just annotating for its own sake, but annotating for to the point where you can help yourself think more clearly about what you want to say.
I think that's very interesting, because there's an awful lot of activity at the moment of people sort of, I think, following the path with good intent but wrongly, of saying, you know, the reason there is disagreement is I'm not explaining myself well enough. Mm-hmm. Which the hubris in that, of course, is that people may still disagree, however well we've explained it. But I think your point there about at least communicating what you think correctly is remarkably powerful. So in other words, instead of basically working entirely from the point of view that what you're trying to do is correct the errors in somebody else's understanding, is say, well, if my start point is at least I've said what I meant, then in a sense my job is done.
Exactly.
Yeah, and also
also
your writing can, like, the span of time that you spend writing can be like a week or 2 hours or a year. So it's very interesting that you can see a graph view of the meaning of what you're writing, even though, like, it doesn't matter the span that you started, like, writing from. So it's interesting to see, okay, you started like last year writing this, and then today this is the meaning, or this is how it shifts to your understanding.
Exactly.
Which is very cool.
It becomes additive, which is kind of what the essence of Standoff is. It's this additive system that doesn't obscure or destroy the original.
And certainly, I mean, a view that's missing in a lot of things actually is a temporal view. And that temporal view might be your writing, like, when did I write this? It might be that someone has, you know, a current thing now is sort of popular history as it's done now, jumps all over the place to make a nice narrative. But at some point you're thinking, well, wait a minute, did this happen before that? Because there is some relevance to knowing that. And it's not that you have to have a very old style linear narrative that, you know, first the earth cooled and then the dinosaurs, that sort of thing. But just simply being able to say, oh, can I see these in a sense in the order that they were happening? Oh, right. So in this country, or, you know, it's stranded. So in this country, this is happening roughly around the time that this is happening. So, without you, the nice thing is doing it gently. So you're not forcing an association that doesn't exist, Because all too often there's a mechanistic assumption that, oh, well, if so-and-so was sort of alive at the same point, they must have known about one another. Well, communications weren't what they are now. So, that's perhaps overreach, but just to know that, or it's just that it's this long ago from this other thing that I'm looking about, what might have happened, what might have changed. That's tremendous. That's tremendously powerful. And that's something that, again, you might think, well, if I'm working with a text tool, why does the temporal aspect matter? Well, actually, it does matter rather a lot. Well, if you want a richness of understanding.
I think the reason for that is that we're not really dealing with text. We think we're writing text, but what we're essentially publishing is, and this is maybe in a sense where the language models have the right way of framing this, we're essentially publishing databases of tokens. And what we're publishing a highly condensed database, which then is unpacked and interpreted and processed through another system, another person's understanding. And the problem is, the beauty of language is that, it's not a problem of language that it is ambiguous or it's polysemic, whatever. But the problem is when we lose track of the connection between the text and the idea, and we end up passing without understanding or noticing from one end to the other, and we get lost in the letter of the word and not the spirit of what's being talked about. And the problem is that the spirit, if you like, is actually the thing that someone is trying to communicate to us can be highly complicated, and it can, to communicate this complicated thing in the right way, these ideas need to be connected in the right way, in the right sequence. And it's very difficult to juggle that and juggle language at the same time. And that's where I think an annotated text is very powerful, because it allows us to have the language there, but we can keep on adding this context. Where essentially what we're doing is we're turning that text into what I think was as a model. And the implication of turning a text into a model is that you need not just one view, you need multiple views. And that's kind of what I think we'll be talking about, and what connects us back to Engelbart and Ted Nelson, is that human beings need a synoptic view. That's the way that our brains understand the world. It's not through text alone. It's not through spreadsheets alone, or data or entities, relationships, or even timelines. We need as many views as are available to us to help us to see things three-dimensionally. And that's where I think the real power of annotation, but not just the annotation, but the whole system around that, of the system of making the text, the system of viewing the text, the system of interrogating the text, the system of creating projections from the models that connect. And we are building essentially an additive model that is between and connects all these texts in the system. That's what's happening with Roam Research. It's happening with Codex. You're creating links between things, you're creating a model. And that's the power, I think, for anyone who wants to think better, is to have a system which allows you to express yourself with text and to refine that into a model, and then to have projections that, first of all, have been created by the programmer, but are ultimately are user controllable, where you can create new kinds of projections, and you can store the output of that and think about that projection as a thing in itself. And I think that's what I feel like maybe what Ted Nelson is kind of getting at, is that we've just been locked into this way of thinking about text, but really what we're thinking about is models, and text is just one view of that model.
Oh man, this is fascinating. And it's been almost 90 minutes. We've been chatting here. I don't know if you want to continue, but yeah, this is yeah. Oh, you shared the standard properties here. Good.
yeah, that's the demo of the
One
first
interesting
version.
thing that I so listening to you just now is that another really interesting aspect is that I'm conscious, I'm incredibly lucky that I happen to speak my native language is the one that sort of has been at the center of most computerization things. So that's amazingly privileged. Plus, there's a larger English corpus and things. But it occurs to me, I mean, because one of the things I do is I actually write effectively a knowledge base for the PKM tool that I use. So it's writing a toolbox about a toolbox. And of course, what everybody wants is a set of articles that describe how to do their homework. And that's too much stuff. What I can do is I can tell you what all the bits do. And if you want to take a 5-sprocket wheel and attach it to a pendulum or something, this is how you do it. What you make with it is up to you. But I'm conscious in that the joy of writing something like that is people will constantly write to you and sort of after sort of circling around, they'll say, well, it's all very well, I read it all, but it didn't make any sense. And when you correspond with them, often it comes down to vocabulary, vernacular, the way you write it, the terms you use, or and that's without having to translate from another language. So a really interesting part of the annotation at the level and granularity you're doing it is to be able to even say with a domain that you don't know. So if you're deep in the sciences and you're doing something deep in the humanities, so every time they mention this, what it means in terms that I understand. My understandable definition, every time I see this word, this is what it means. Yeah. I mean, I find that very hard to do in the moment. It becomes hard to read something where a lot of the terminology is, because there's just some things, it doesn't matter how often you read it, it just doesn't stick. I don't know why, it just doesn't. Yeah. So that ability, because in essence, one of the other things you can do is begin to put a translation layer onto it. I mean, that's not the intent of the original author, but the affordances are now there, so that you can say, right, so that this sort of terminology or this intent, I can now encode in a way that I can lay back over it.
Yeah.
Which might be as subtle as you want. It might be that you just might color certain sections so that as a prompt to you when you're reading, that it says to you, oh, right, and thinking in your own first language, say, oh, right, so this is broadly what this is discussing. And I think that could be tremendously powerful as well, because as you say, a lot of the problem is about communication. And it's, these are sins of omission, and partly because we don't have the richness of tools to do what we might otherwise happily do if we were able to do it without great complexity.
Absolutely, and I think this is I think like Richards was feeling and Orwell was articulating, which is the tools start to dictate to us, if not exactly what to think, they dictate certain boundaries and it's, even if it's a boundary of convenience, because it requires so much energy to overcome, to generate explanation to people, that we fall back on shorthand, which is always in danger of becoming a jargon and a substitute for actual clear thinking. And there's a possibility there that annotation can help us. Maybe we can write freely what we want to write, but we can then annotate more specific references. And then if we have a system for sharing that, then let's say you're producing this as an authority on this product, then I, as someone buying this product and reading your technical notation, I could then maybe annotate that myself to make it a bit more understandable to me, and I can connect things that you're saying to other things in my knowledge base. And I think we also have to see as well that annotation works in different modes, and there's strengths and weaknesses of each mode. So I mean, the strength of pointing very specifically to that one entity and taking the time to think about what is that entity, and then not finding an entity and creating a new entity and then relating them. That's a time-consuming exercise which can have great benefit. However, it may not be the thing that you want to do when you're reading something through for the first time. What you want to do is start parceling up, saying, this block of something is connected to that block, and I'm creating stepping stones through the stream. And I just want to jump from one to the other to help me tackle this article. And so I think like annotation the interface needs to account for, these levels of highly technical annotation down to something more tacit. And I think that's where I think we can learn from paper again. Is not so much like how can I recreate the document on screen, but what are the notation systems that people use when reading and annotating an article that we could translate into markup in a way, that is valuable to people.
Yeah, because I mean, ironically, you're in a sense, it's a sort of benign constraint system. In other words, in order to say what I mean, well, what is the portal through which I must pass? Because if my load is too wide, I will not get through the hole.
Yes.
Because I was also thinking, saying that it's interesting too about what thoughts we need. If tools like this become more widely used, how late we're going to leave it in putting it into our sort of education system, because annotation for most people now is writing stuff, whether it's marginalia or sort of highlighting bits of text, and that's actually quite meager, or it works for the individual. But it strikes me there's an interesting balance here for people who are sort of completely new to this, between the sort of entirely human element of your intent and enough understanding of the technology without it being something about which you're fighting. I mean, it's terribly depressing. A lot of people, when offered anything rich, will say, "Oh, it's too complex," or they'll say, "It has code in it, and I don't like code." They won't tell you what code it is. It's just it is itself just a term for "I don't like it." It's not what I'm used to. Rather than saying, "No, here's something rich that you can use." But the sort of rules, the broad rules you need to understand in terms of what you can do. So you may not be able to do everything you can imagine, but you can probably do a lot of things also that you haven't imagined yet. So it's sort of giving people the understanding, because at the moment a lot of this is, in a sense, necessarily close to the people who actually know how it's built, because well, that's the way these things happen. But it's interesting how you then move it on to a wider audience. So you take something that's rich, take it to someone who has, in a sense, has no interest in terms of background. They don't care why it was built or what it was built for, but they have they definitely are doing something that could gain massively from its use, and seeing what's missing from the map. I mean, because you can't predict before the fact, but I suspect that kind of thing will be interesting in pointing us to sort of human interventions we want to make in terms of how we become better. This is really
important, I think. And I think like we have to be really, really humble and about the problem that we have in communicating technology, and it's a kind of marketing, okay? It's, in a sense, but let's just call it communication. The problem of communicating any technology to any other person, we have to be humble about the fact that we don't know, what is the best way of translating the technology into some concept that they can understand and see the value of. And we often think we know what that is. We think, oh, this is the thing that's powerful to me. But actually to them, it's meaningless, or you show them something, they see the appearance of it. In many ways, it can even come down to the content of what you show. You have to be careful about, do I show a historical document or do I show an email? Because in a split second that people are looking at this, they're making assumptions about what this thing does. And I've found along the way that I've had lots of miscommunication, lots of failure to translate why I think standoff is powerful. And I think the interesting thing is, like, I think most of what I've shown you guys, if I didn't tell you that standoff was involved, you might never know that standoff was involved. I mean, for all you know, I could be lying. It could all be something else.
Yeah, it's transparent. It's transparent to the user.
Exactly. And I think that's important to remember, is that we want it to be transparent to the user in many ways, but also that's part of the problem, because you're telling, like, and this is where I think show people first, because they don't understand all of the technology in between. It's misleading, and you're having the wrong conversation. You shouldn't be talking to them about the technology. That's also partly why I was saying talk about the social element, because what people might not, if you say, well, standoff is good for overlap, well, what does that mean? I mean, how useful is that? But if I say, well, imagine you have a website where we record all of the lyrics of all the rap songs, and you can go in and you can highlight anything, and you can tell me what this means, and someone else can come in and tell me what this means, and they can highlight over you, if you like, and add more meanings or argue with you, whatever. And at the end of it, I'll get the rap song, which has got this incredible amount of information, which ties back exactly to the lyrics, and not just to something abstract away from the song. I mean, what I've described is basically a standoff system, a standoff commentary system. But someone can hear that and go, oh, well, a rap song, that means something to me. Expertise means something to me. What is this song about? What does it mean? You know, people's opinion is important to me.
Yeah,
I can add my own opinion, and I don't have to be the creator or the author of the system. My opinion is just as much recorded as anyone else's opinion. So then we add standoff gives agency to people. So what I found interesting discussing on Twitter is that what things create the most engagement or reaction or thinking about this, create the most feelings about it, is when you talk about things like agency, expression, and don't focus so much on the technology. You say, well, what is this doing for me? What is it doing for, me with communicating with you? How does it help me understand what I've written or someone else has written? How is this as a tool for a community? I think that's the thing with technology. It's so easy to think about the technological affordances, and we go, oh, it's obviously so much more powerful. Why would you not use this? But we have to kind of think about, well, what are the buttons we press to make someone feel something about it?
Well, it's interesting.
That can be surprising.
It's interesting too, because I mean, there's a problem of you rightly say, what you show people can massively affect their ability to connect. I think the problem you then hit is that, so I see this happen all the time, is that they then ask for something that you can't do simply because no one's ever asked for that before. Probably can be done, but it can't be done this instant. And what it lays bare is someone will say, but it's obvious. And actually what they were describing is a beautiful mental model which they can't deconstruct for you. So you end up in this problem in trying to say to them, no, you can do this, or you can do, often in a way you didn't imagine. And this is where the problem comes, because there's most of us have a resistance that the idea we first, or the sort of the route to our goal that we first thought of is the only one, apart from the fact that, I mean, we don't really know what it is, but we just sort of felt that this was important. And even the politest attempt to say, well, actually, if you just go around this way instead, is met with a certain degree of sort of hostility and doubt, as if you're being slightly taken for a ride. So that after the engagement, that it's a sort of daily challenge I find in communicating some of the stuff I work with people is just getting to say, look, instead of basically telling me, I suppose the analogy is, it's like the person who stands in the room and tells the painter they've done it wrong. And when they say, what color do you want? You say, well, I want the right color. I'll cut, you paint the room again. And then, so you've got to build all this stuff and it's wrong because it's just easier to make that simple judgment that it's not like the thing I imagine than to actually explain what you want, which can be hard because often we don't, we may not have the tokens, the terminology at our fingertips to describe it. But the funny that getting people to begin to play with the tools, I find, is where where they
Yeah.
suddenly will teach themselves, oh, right, I see that actually I have all these things. And if I just learn a bit more about how they work, I don't have to understand how they work, but I know what they do, then I can get myself to the endpoint.
Exactly. I think that's a great insight. I think getting it into people's hands. I mean, it sounds simple. It's complicated, but and it's complicated for the developer because because there's potentially extremely valuable feedback there, and kind of also what you were saying is that, the other dimension is that there may be feedback there that you don't want to hear. The thing that you cherish, you think is very important, is crucial. The thing that you set out to do, someone, just dismisses it because they don't understand it. But what they've actually told you is that they've told you something that's very important to them, and that could end up being the thing which is most transformative for a bigger group of people. And it could be, it's something that comes from a place where, if you're developing these tools, you're in a very technical mindset. You're in a problem-solving mindset, and you can get in love with that, the challenge of that, and intoxicated with the power of that. And sometimes it's helpful for someone to come along and just brush that aside and say, well, yes, what I really wanted to do was to have two documents on screen and highlight both of them and then write something in the middle or draw arrows between them. Or I really don't want to do specific annotations. I don't want to go look up stuff. I just want to highlight stuff.
It's like, I think very often, in a rich system, the irony is that probably it can be done. The challenge is to get someone says just hold on less tight for a moment. So so what you've described is the following. They'll say, yes, well, you can do that, really. Yes, just not in the way you imagine.
Yes.
At which point you can say, because there are some constraints. Yeah. So some of the things that you imagine that can be done can't be done, or can't be done now, or can't be done within the what we have available, cost, time, all these things. But more often than not, they are sort of tractable. And the interesting thing is that it's meshing these two sorts of problem solving, because the person who is in this context less technical is actually still problem solving, but they're doing it in a much more loose associative way. And this goes back to what I was thinking about, a gap probably in some of our training and education at the moment is we don't teach people to cross that boundary. We almost say, here's the arts, and or you can go and learn to program.
Mm-hmm.
And that's tremendously sad, but I don't see that. I don't see them. I don't see that split at all myself. And because the more there's a perceived split, the more there's a fear of stepping across that boundary, and it makes it really difficult. So no, you can do this. You can do what you imagine. You basically need to learn, in essence, a new language, a new process.
I think this is also a problem in the programming community. I think that there's often a tendency to think of programming as being a very intellectual, structured activity, whereas I often find the most interesting things that I'm working on are the most creative things are like writing a story or drawing a picture. And they're in a similar frame of mind, like contemplation. I'm not actually writing code. I'm thinking about, I'm away from it. I'm thinking about something that maybe has very little to do with code or memory or data structures. And eventually this kind of comes down into something that could be confined into a data structure or an algorithm. But there's a lot of programming that really isn't programming. It's not code spinning at all, or architecture. It's actually something that's closer to improvisation and imagination. I think it would be good if programming courses taught more of that attitude, I think, and books which are often very functional, focused about doing things in certain patterns. But actually, the thing that I enjoy about programming is that I like to create with it, like as an activity. Like I like trying to be creative. And I mean, some of that is fulfilled by solving a problem in the code. How do I do this? But a lot of it is coming from well before the code. It's in the interface, or it's in it's in interface things that don't even exist yet. It's just you're thinking about how do these two things connect in my mind, and oftentimes these things you can't work out how to do, but that's what's stimulating, I find. And that's what I've enjoyed working on Codex and Standoff and all the connections between that and the graph. And like that's not coming from the mindset of using programming in my day job, you know, which is much more prescriptive. It really feels like a more creative activity. So I think just as the users kind of need to maybe trust, you know, the constraints of the system and learn them and exploit them, the programmers need to kind of look at the arts as well, I think, and the humanities, and be a bit more open to being in a creative state, I think.
That's the very paper I'm just writing at the moment. Where can we, where is it possible to see a bit more about, so what stage is the sort of project at?
Okay, so you kind of think of it as being, in a way, two different projects or two versions of the same project. And so there is the end point of the first version of Codex is probably the version which is being used at the University of Mainz in Germany, where they've adapted Codex for annotating Hildegard von Bingen's letters. And there's the version of Codex, and this is similar to this version, that I'm using for annotating Michelangelo and Leoducci information. And that was the version I worked on myself in a kind of prototyping way. The version we're doing at the moment is a clean break. So we're bringing the ideas across of Standoff and the graph and so on, but it's built on a completely different foundation. So, and that foundation is more experimental. It's a reactive kernel, which means that it keeps track of everything that you're doing. You could undo, redo, eventually you can branch or merge. And that's baked into the system. So almost like that would be like a software primitive that the developer could not even have to think about. And this is going to be the same with Standoff text as well. So that version, it's hard to predict, to give, and it's because the core of it is more experimental. And this is what my co-founder is working on. The majority of that is his ideas. What we are aiming to get this year is where that kernel is stable enough that we can start implementing, building on top of that, kind of what I had done in my own prototype. And they kind of meet in the middle, basically. So hopefully this year, that version will be usable in some form for people as a standalone desktop application, which will be a local first application with all the data inside the application. The other version is a server-hosted version. You can run it locally on your computer if you can set up a server, or it's run in the cloud, basically. And that version is, I've abandoned work on that version because we're working on the new one. But I can demonstrate that, and like I have been today with those documents. And it might be interesting at times to look at that if you are interested in seeing other texts and other things we can do with it. But it doesn't represent the final state. What we're going to do is basically look at porting across the things that work the best from there into the new system.
Thanks. And I was just, I'm just excited by the idea of such rich annotation, because it's in a sense, accidentally, if nothing else, so far from most of the things I'm seeing at the moment, they're doing annotation are effectively moving paper written annotation into a paper digital form, which is fine, but doesn't float my boat particularly.
Yeah. I think we have to. To me, like at the end of the day, it's all about what we're creating as models, and the annotation is not just a way of encoding data. It's also a process for creating the model. So that's why I've got it as a rich text document where you can highlight and you can link things, and you can say, well, this link is a type of this, and it's visualized with a different color or something. Because what we're adding is more semantics to the document, but we're getting more than the document. And I think this is where I think the limitation of, say, XML approach of putting all of that XML into one document is that everything that you've said becomes local to that document. Again, it becomes like paper. It becomes local to the page. Whereas what we want is to free that annotation. We want to put that model out into the graph so that all the other documents can connect to it and build it. And each document then gets the possibility of having access to a richer set of relationships in this kind of accumulative process, to the point where we might even start importing things into the graph. Let's say we could go into Wikidata, start seeding the system with, get me the city of Florence, fetch all the important facts about it, its relationships to nearby cities, then boom, that's in your knowledge base as a model that at any point you could link to, query it, whatever. So I think that's what the power of annotation will be for building models, and then the problem is having a system for managing that building of the model and the projections on top of the model.
Yeah, and manage the links between data and how they related between each other. Yep.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, with that remark, I'm sorry, but I need to go. Yeah. It was very fun, very interesting. I put the link of the repo with the markdown that I started doing. I'm gonna push the notes that I added for this one. Feel free to, it's public, so feel free to add whatever you want and contribute to it. Let's try next week to do it again. Maybe I don't know if it's better for anyone else at other time, but if no one else like say anything, we can keep the same time. I'm happy with this time. So so yeah. Thanks everyone.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Love to see Minter next week.
Thanks, Ian. See you next week. Bye.
Okay. Bye for now.